Hello and welcome to this podcast from Blackwell Online. My name is George Miller, and my guest today is Eric Kaufmann, who's reader in politics and sociology at Birkbeck in London. This month, Eric is bringing out a book entitled Shall the Religious Inherit the Earth? To which a simple answer is yes, probably, if the demographic trend, which suggests a correlation between fundamentalist belief and fertility rate, continues. Eric argues that as those with strong religious beliefs, be they Muslim, Christian or Jewish, increase in number, so too will their political clout, and that has implications for freedoms that liberal modernity has led us to take for granted in the West: freedom of choice over birth control and abortion, freedom of speech, women's rights, and so on. So I began my interview by remarking that the book gave a strong impression that the gains made by modern secularism were far from irreversible.
Yeah, that's one of the messages of the book, is that in fact we have seen secularization. We're seeing it now, particularly in Western Europe, but that actually it is reversible. It's not necessarily going to be the case that you're going to have mass religious enthusiasm that's going to reverse secularism or people drifting back into the churches. It's much more a case, in my book, of a sort of hidden mechanism, slow return of religion through demography, through either, in this case, either religious immigration or through higher religious fertility than secular fertility.
Let's tease apart those two things then. I mean, tell me about demography. How does demography work in tandem with the changing shape of the religious complexion of the planet?
Right. Well, most people on the planet get their religion from their parents, so it's a largely inherited faith. There are actually comparatively few people who choose their religion. I mean, it's more common in the United States than anywhere else, but still there's a very high inherited component. And what that means is then demography is going to have a big impact on faith. So Islam is the world's fastest growing religion, or fastest growing major religion, and that is because of demography. It's because the Muslim world has had very fast population growth compared to other parts of the world. That's just one example of how demography can affect religion, whereas atheism and non-religion has declined. Now, that isn't strictly just because of demography. It's also because of the collapse of communism, but it's also because of demography. So the two things together have an impact.
And do you think there's a relationship between these fertility rates of atheists and believers in terms of their sort of worldview, that the worldview of an atheist tends to be more individualistic, therefore the birth rate drops, whereas there's a more communitarian attitude among religious believers?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of one of the aspects that I get into in my book, and that is that there's a link. I mean, if you look at the holy texts, particularly the Abrahamic texts, go forth and multiply, for example. I mean, there's an emphasis on women as in the role of mothers, traditional women's roles, and those emphases on traditional gender roles and on fertility will lead to higher fertility if you take those injunctions seriously. So there is a reason to believe, there's actually a logic behind higher religious fertility, particularly higher religious fundamentalist fertility. And we can also talk about injunctions against birth control and abortion and so forth. Likewise, with secularism, this idea of expressive individualism fits in very well with delaying childbirth, perhaps choosing to travel and have a career, also women's liberation, all of these things. So you would think logically they would lead to different fertility patterns. And in fact, the data pretty well all over the world show that trend. And really, I think we also need to distinguish, there are two trends here. One is the fact that the religious, particularly fundamentalists, have higher fertility than moderate and secular people. The other is the indirect effect. So the indirect effect is where you have poor people or rural people who happen to be more religious, and happen to have large families. They have large families not because they're more religious, but because they're poor. But they happen also to be religious, so when they move to the cities, when they move to more prosperous societies, they bring their religion with them. So there are two things going on. One is the direct effect of religious people having more kids, and the other is the indirect effect of poor people, A, having more kids, and B, being more religious.
As parts of the developing world become better off, as sanitation, as infant mortality are addressed, do you believe that the fertility rate will drop among the religious, or do you think that the trend line will continue in its present direction?
Well, in the developing world, what's already happening is fertility rates are coming down quite quickly. In fact, the UN predicts that by the mid-2030s we'll have replacement level fertility on a worldwide basis. So that it's already happening, but what's important to note is it's actually happening to poor countries. But if you look within those countries, there is a growing disjunction between the fundamentally religious and the rest. And this is partly what some of the new demographic theories are discovering, is that as infant mortality is cut, as there's better sanitation, as there's more availability of contraception, how many children you have is no longer forced upon you by material circumstances, such as having to have children because most of them will die or because they need to work the land. So why do you have more children? Increasingly it becomes a choice. Increasingly it becomes linked to values. So you have a stronger and stronger link between religious fundamentalism and religious belief and fertility. So in the Muslim world, for example, in the countryside, there's no real connection between how much you support Sharia law and how many children you have. In the cities, where there is less of an material incentive to have children, there is more availability of contraception. There, you actually see a growing gap between those who believe strongly in Sharia, that should be the law of the land. They have twice the fertility rate of those who are most opposed to Sharia. So actually, what's happening is in the more modern contexts, you get a bigger gap between the religious and the secular. So it's almost a curious aspect of modernization.
Do you think there is a serious threat to Western liberal secular ways of life in this shift, this demographic shift that you describe?
I actually do. I think it's a longer-term threat. It's shorter-term in some societies, but I think it's a matter of a century or two if we're really talking about major shifts in Western Europe or in the United States. But I think you can look at certain countries such as Israel and see the shift happening more quickly. So if you look at the ultra-Orthodox in Israel, who have 3 times the fertility of other Jews, particularly of secular Jews, they've increased from several percentage of the population in 1948 to, if you look at the primary schools in Israel, 1/3 of Jewish primary schoolers in grade 1 are now ultra-Orthodox. That's up from several percent in 1960. And the same thing is actually happening in the Jewish diaspora. So in Britain and the United States, ultra-Orthodox have 3 to 4 times the fertility rate. In Britain, they are 17% of the Jewish population. They're 3/4 of the Jewish births. And so you see these astounding trends. By 2050, they'll have taken over Anglo Jewry, American Jewry, and in Israel, it'll happen in the second half of this century. So that's going to mean an astounding change. Already you're seeing the power of the ultra-Orthodox parties in Israel has multiplied. They're now a factor in the peace process in blocking concessions on East Jerusalem and in a whole series of issues. That's only going to become more powerful. They're involved in boycotts of particular products that promote evolution, and they're involved in Shabbat, sort of no driving on the Sabbath in parts of Jerusalem. So that kind of politics is going to become more influential as a result of demography, of the kind that I'm talking about. Yes, it's happening first in Israel, but I believe it's a manifestation of a broader trend that will make itself felt also in Europe and the United States.